Welcome everyone to Click Moments, where the right information at the right time is a portal from where you are to where you want to be. And I'm your host, Beth Orr, and today we're going to be talking about finding and growing beyond our blind spots. Now, I want to define this right off the bat because sometimes people are like, what are we even talking about here? Blind spots are something within us that we have no idea is there. These scare the heck out of me. I mean, at least when you have something that's a part of yourself that you're like, I want to grow, I want to be better at this, I know that I need to focus on this, we can actually focus on it. But blind spots means we don't have any idea that it's inside of us. And that to me is the hardest thing, obviously, to pivot. So why does this matter? Why it matters is because if we have blind spots, what's going to happen is something's going to keep happening over and over and over in our life. Maybe you already are experiencing that, something that you're like confused by, a little bit disoriented, that you're like, why does this keep happening? If it keeps happening, sometimes it's because you have a blind spot. You have something that your body as a biological organism is protecting you from recognizing. But here's the thing. Is it really protecting you? There are so many parts of us that protect us. Like as a species, we are always thinking of being safe, but yet oftentimes our body responds as if we're in danger when we're not. And what happens is that when we recognize that something's happening to us, then we can say, nuh-uh, no. Like, I know this is something that I'm not to be afraid of. But when we have a blind spot, we will believe that it's something that we should be afraid of. And it just means that we don't have enough information at this particular juncture to recognize it. We need to get more information so that when this thing comes up again in the future, we can have a different result. So why it's really important that we take a look at and discover blind spots is because we want something to stop happening in our life. We want to have more awareness. And so in order to do that, we have to have this receptivity. So what happens when we have blind spots is we develop confabulations. So Brene Brown talks about this. I equate this to what she talks about as the stories we tell ourselves. So when we're in a relationship with somebody, because it's usually like something that is triggered by somebody, and we're going to talk about triggers a little bit more later. But what happens is that we are triggered in a conversation. We're having a conversation with somebody and we're like, immediately we tense up. And Brene Brown talks about how we have these stories that we tell ourselves. So we immediately start with a script. And that script is informing us about what's happening, but yet we have very little information to actually say, is this true? And so we start going down this path and we start getting deeper and deeper into it. And that then starts informing us. Our body starts responding as if this script is true. Well, once you've got this flood of chemicals as if this story is true, it's really hard to pull back from it. Like our brain believes it, our thoughts are like, this is what's happening. So then everything that comes in after that point is being filtered through that old script. And unless we have awareness, and this is where a blind spot is challenging, because unless we have awareness to this is what's happening or that this cord is being pulled, then we can't shift that story. That story is so ingrained in us so deeply that we believe it. And this is where what you'll find is, do you ever have those times where you're like, this is crazy making? Like, I'm like, what's happening here? This is that confusion and that disorientation that we get because we're like, this doesn't make sense. I thought I knew this person, or I thought this was going to be different. And then all of a sudden you're running down this path and you believe something that isn't true. And it's so scary. It's so disorienting. But here's the thing. It's pulling on a cord that is so hurtful to us. Something from the past that is so hurtful to us that we're trying to work through. We're trying to work through these old scripts because we want a different result. We don't want to have the same thing happen to us again. And so we're trying to experience something different. But unless we're open and curious about what's happening and able to shut down this automatic response, this danger response, if we're not able to do that in that moment, then we're bypassing our ability to have any kind of new information come in that actually does allow us to change the situation. So one of the reasons why blind spots scares me so much too is that it informs me that I have a belief system inside me that isn't true. A blind spot is not being able to see reality as it is with somebody else's information being taken in. Like in reality, it's not just about what we think. There's always in relationship to other people or to our environment. And so when we have a blind spot, we're just cut off from our ability to be open to what's really happening in society, what's really happening in this situation that I find myself in, what's really happening from this other person's perspective. And so a blind spot means that we're shut down to that. It's not a boundary, it's a wall that we've created. It's not like, we're like taking it in from our piece of information and then listening and saying, I'm gonna receive it through this lens. It's that this is what it is. And so anything that comes beyond us, we're not able to actually receive it because of the emotions that we're feeling. Sometimes what's happening when we have these blind spots is that we're experiencing something that is directly linked, and this is most times directly linked to our childhood. And it can bring a lot of feelings along with it. Sometimes we have depression, sometimes we have anxiety. More recently, there has been more talk about ADHD type symptoms. I mean, think about it. In our busy culture right now, there's so many opportunities with the news that we're taking in to pull on cords of depression and anxiety, because everything is like, if you're an empath or if you relate to or take in the stories that you're experiencing, then people are stressed, and that stress creates anxiety. When you realize the emotion of people's situations, it can pull on depression. And then with the busyness and the distractibility and the need to do more, it pulls on, these ADHD, there's too much to do. There's many things happening at once. But what's interesting is we have with ADHD, there is this prefrontal cortex issue from childhood that we have. In order for our prefrontal cortex to actually function appropriately, it needs to feel safe. And so when we're in childhood and we experience trauma, we don't feel safe. And so what happens is that there's a disruption. So when you're having a moment now where you do not feel safe, then this prefrontal cortex begins to have difficulty taking in new information, which is why we struggle to be able to understand what's happening. And so when we create these confabulations, confabulations are basically, like I said, Brene says it's the stories we tell ourselves, but what it really means is that something's happening now, and we're not able to take in the information about what it could be in absence of this old script. So we create this story. So confabulation is the lies that we tell ourselves about what's happening in front of us. And it's gonna be created based upon the least stressful response that we can come up, or solution that we can come up with. And so that's what's fascinating to me. Like it may be an awful and stressful solution that we come up with, but it's the solution that we know what to do with. We shut down, we fight, we leave. It's the fight, flight, freeze response. But we know how we've dealt with it in the past, and that's worked. And so we do that. But what happens is that it may not be true what we're responding to. And so we could actually take in more information and respond in a different way. I think it's important to understand that when people come up with these stories, they're not lies though. What it is we're doing the best we can to make sense of the confusion that's happening around us. When you're not steeped in the present and you have this old script, then you're doing your best to be able to create safety really quick, because it's a spike of stress hormones, which means your prefrontal cortex isn't working and you're trying to calm yourself down in that moment really, really quickly, right? But it's not, and when somebody is coming up with this and they're trying to explain it, it's not an excuse. Like, an excuse is something that is a conscious decision to suppress something, right? An excuse is like, oh, well, let me explain to you, so you're making this conscious decision. Let me explain to you what's going on, but it's really that you're trying to suppress it. What's happening, blind spots are actually something that's trying to protect you. It's trying to make sure that you're okay. It's like, no, we're not gonna look at this. And you have to remember, like, as a biological species, it's just trying to protect us, right? We're just trying to figure out, how do we get safety quick? It's not concerned if you're happy. It's not concerned if you're gonna get beyond something. It's not concerned if this is gonna happen again. It's not long-term focus. It's just short-term, right now, get it under control, make sure that this entire ecosystem inside of us is calming down and being okay. So I recently had something happen where I was like, oh my gosh, like, is it possible that I have a blind spot? Like, I was going through in my mind, like, what's happening here? Like, I'm starting to realize that confusion and that disorientation means step back, what's going on here? And one of the things I came up with was, do I have a blind spot? Maybe that I don't see? And I always start to get really curious about it now, because it doesn't scare me. It actually scares me more to leave that belief system intact, if that's more of a risk, because then it's just you're just signing up for it over and over and over again. But if you're open to, I wonder where this is coming from, then you can start to say, well, I want to get beyond this, right? So I started to ask myself some questions. So I'm going to share these questions with you that I found helpful myself. And maybe if you feel like you have a blind spot, then you can ask yourself these questions too. First of all, have several people given you feedback that says this exact same thing? Now, maybe you don't relate to it. Maybe they've said something about you and said, hey, is this a thing? Or do you notice this pattern? You may not. But oftentimes what happens is when somebody shares it with you, they have a very clear idea themselves through their own filter and through their own trauma. Oftentimes they have an explanation for it that you don't identify with. But instead of taking the meat, the essence of what they're mentioning, just the fact that they see or what they perceive as a fact, but whatever they're seeing, oftentimes we get rid of the actual very good observation because of the meaning that they've prescribed to it. But what if we were just to step back and say, wait, regardless of how this is impacting them, regardless of what their meaning is that they've given to it, or the emotion that I felt in that moment when I received it, what if you were able to just take that, whatever that observation was, and sit with it? Just sit with it, right? And so that's one way to unearth a potential blind spot, is to listen to multiple times that different people have noticed it. Maybe not the same person, but multiple people. Unless you have a trusted person that seems to be compassionately trying to tell it to you, then that one person may be the perfect person to tell you something that maybe is hard for you to see. And I will also add that you'll see it when you're ready. So try to be kind to yourself, that when you're not ready, you're not going to see it. And when it's time, you're going to know, right? Second question is, when you get quiet, does that create a lot of anxiety for you? Oftentimes in this silence, there's something that we're trying to avoid. And I look at it like, we don't intentionally do this, but man, what a convenient excuse it is. And like I said, not necessarily an excuse, it's a protection measure, but it's really convenient for us to stay so busy that if we're consciously trying to suppress something, that's an excuse. But when we have no idea, that busyness stops us from being able to listen in the silence to whatever's coming up. Number 3, this is a big one. Do you have a hot button or a trigger that keeps coming up? That when it does, in a situation, that spike of stress response, right? So we're just going to touch briefly on triggers. So you know that there is fight, flight, and freeze, right? So when you're fighting, you're going to get defensive. You're gonna actually get in this stance of defending yourself in this situation. But it's a really strong response. It's not this, banter oftentimes. It's a really stressful, a real need to have this be your way, or be seen your way, or for you to be right. Oftentimes there's something going on that is a belief system inside of us that's really hurtful, right? And so we're fighting because in the past we've had to fight in order for things, an equilibrium, to get back. And so that's worked oftentimes in childhood. Like if we push back in a situation, if we actually make a case or something, if we start to get loud, then the situation calms down. And so because that worked in the past, we're doing it now. But the blind spot comes into, that worked back then, we don't need to do that now. If we can understand what's happening and understand our response and approach it from a space of kindness, that this is what worked for us before. Like last time in the last podcast, I was talking about the war is over. So we don't need to respond that way anymore. And so once we understand that the war is over and that we don't need to respond that way, then we can choose our words. We can start to step back and see this from a different space. But we have to have our prefrontal cortex online. We have to not have those spikes of stress hormones, which means that we have to be in a safe space where somebody can actually hear us, or we have to be by ourselves in a calmer state of mind so that all of our brain is activated and we can actually logically think through something. Another response besides fight is flight. And that means that we're just gonna take off. And that means that in childhood, that worked for us. That if something bad happened, we got the heck out of there. I've been reading Viola Davis's autobiography, Finding Me, and she talks about that response where, in their family, that there were times that people just ran out of the house and they got out of there. And it's actually just an amazing autobiography. If you haven't read her memoir, it's amazing just on resiliency. And if you're trying to understand about trauma responses and overcoming, brilliant. It's a beautiful, and it might even be an opportunity. I feel like when we take in other people's stories, sometimes it allows for us in memoirs to identify with some part of somebody's life, and it illuminates, just like having that little bit of distance, illuminates something that we identify with. And when we identify with it, we can get curious and say, what's going on here that this is so interesting to me? I've highlighted this, I've underlined it, I've read it 10 times because I'm whoa, I'm in wonder at that response, or something in this situation resonates with me. That's a good sign that, make a note of that. It may or may not be something that you're ready to excavate, but it's definitely something that you're ready to start being aware of, because you are being aware of it. for some reason. And usually it's an identification as opposed to just like an interest. It's usually something that we relate to that's it's percolating and it's coming up. Another, when we have that hot button response, is to freeze. And all of these responses can produce a tremendous amount of confusion, or there could be a strong response that's really stressful, or there could be shame. Brene Brown also talks about shame a lot that comes up whenever we have these responses, because in childhood we're just doing our best, but we're also just doing our best now. And if our response is linked to that earlier time, then extending that self-compassion is really important. So in that freeze response, we get quiet, we just shut down. It's like the possum, response, where we just freeze. We're just hoping that nobody sees us, that if we're quiet, that this won't get worse, right? And what that tells you is that probably worked in the past for somebody. Sometimes people deeply dissociate when that happens. Like they shut down. It's like every other part of their body mobilizes in response to the stressful situation, and they're literally in this other space to where they dissociate so much they don't even know what's happening to them, right? And so that can be how we respond now, is that we lose our capacity to use our voice and our language. And so we get frustrated with ourselves and we're like, why did I not say something? Why did I not defend myself? And retrospectively, once our brain comes back online, we're like, why didn't I do this? And why didn't I do that? Why you didn't is because you had a part of your brain shut down that was connected to an earlier part of you. And so the only way that we can respond differently in the future is to gain awareness of this response and to get curious about it and to start making some shifts through starting with awareness. I highly recommend, when you have these types of strong hot button responses, that you find a trusted therapist to work with. I will say, though, that that's my response because I am a therapist and I believe in therapy, but there's certainly other ways to do that. There are trusting relationships that you have. If you have a spouse or a family member or a friend that you can reflect to and feel like you can keep your brain activated and talk through these things, that's certainly another way. I mentioned that I was reading Viola Davis's book. I think it's brilliant what she talks about, and I think this is something that we see sometimes too, is just that we sometimes get into hobbies or interests, or we choose occupations that help us work through things. 87% of people that go through or that are working in the helping profession are experiencing some sort of trauma themselves, specifically like mental health and doing that type of work. And so Viola talks about how she got into acting because there were parts of herself, emotions that she was experiencing that she was disconnected to. And so when she was acting, she embodied those different emotions. It was like she was able to learn what connecting to that part of herself felt like. And that embodiment allowed for her to get into her body, but it was that third person. It was like that little bit of distance that allowed for her to imagine what it felt like to feel these emotions. But then eventually over time, that actually connects to our ability to give language to what's actually happening to us. So I think that was a brilliant observation that she had, because there may be other people that are doing the same thing. We all have different ways that we're trying to safely embody an emotion without it bringing so much stress and pain and all the emotions that have brought us before. We want to stay present with our brain activated instead of a part of us shutting down to be able to deal with it. A fourth question that you might ask yourself if you're trying to discover a blind spot is there anything in your life now or periodically that you ruminate on? Is there something like a scenario that you play over and over and over and over? That rumination, that anxiety, suggests that there's something that it's linked to within you. And sometimes when you talk about it to a trusted other person, what it does is that reflection of just the emotions or the situation starts to bring somebody else into what's happening to where you can get some additional perspective. We're all so firmly ingrained in that cord. That's where the blind spot comes in, is that if A, then B. But yet, is it true? It's just true on our lens. If A might look completely different for somebody else. When we come into a situation, the same stimulus can create a different response for other people. An example is when I see a snake, I freak out. Total freak out. When my brother sees a snake, he picks it up. Like, who does that? Him. And everybody else who doesn't have the same trigger that I have, right? So this is where an additional perspective is really important, to realize that there isn't a universal truth in most things that we're believing, but it's a universal truth to us until we start to recognize and open up that maybe there's something else going on here. Another question that you can ask yourself is there something that you're working hard not to think about or keeps breaking through? Like you're having to suppress it. You're starting to feel like it is an excuse, like, because you're starting to have some conscious awareness that you're working really hard to push something down. And the question is, what are my belief systems? What is this here to teach me? And when we start activating our conscious mind in that scenario, what happens is we're getting out of our limbic system. We're realizing there's nothing to be afraid of here. I'm completely safe. How is it that I'm having this feeling of unsafety, but yet I am safe? Like, look around me. Like, there's nothing to fear here. Or are there other reasons to believe that what I'm thinking isn't true? Maybe the situation or the person in front of you has never given you a reason to feel the things that you're feeling, but you feel it 100% now. And everything else that you used to believe is gone because of this one thing, because there's so much danger in that thing that's linked to your past. So what is this here to teach me? What are my belief systems? What might I be able to look at around this to see this situation more widely? Can I ask some questions of the person in front of me that's also in this situation that would challenge my perspective and give me a different perception of what's happening? Another question to ask ourselves is, do we have a trauma or something to overcome from childhood? Sometimes it's like not even related to this, but just asking, what do I know about myself already that I've already been aware of? So many times when we recognize that we have a trauma or something that we're overcoming, we think that we've already talked about so many things that we know it, that there isn't anything more to see here. But just like the onion and the layer, when you peel back a layer and you peel back a layer and you peel back another layer, there's another layer, right? And so sometimes there's something more that, because we think we understand what happened to us from a total perspective, there's maybe something else that is coming up because there's a unique new situation in front of us that we haven't had before, that creates a new understanding of something or a new belief system that we couldn't possibly have seen because we didn't know it was a thing. And so it doesn't mean we miss something. It means that how do we understand something more completely when we haven't had a situation that's going to challenge our previous perceptions before? So there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just something new. And then the last question I have is when we start asking ourselves, why me? Like, why is this happening to me? Like, if you say this, why me? It suggests that you're confused, right? I mean, that's in essence, when you say why me, it's saying I'm confused about this. When we're confused, we don't have access to some piece of information that is inside of us or outside of us that's going to make sense of this. And so just that question, why me, gives us an opportunity to ask what else could be going on here. I also want to point out that it doesn't mean that it's all going to come to you at once. I'm not trying to say that these questions are going to give you a complete and total illumination of what's happening. What I'm saying is it's going to be the beginning. It's going to be the start. And the more that you recognize what's happening, the less stress you have. Like it's more stressful to suppress this, because what's happening is when we suppress this, we're just keeping the emotions tamped down. The experience is still inside of us. It's like a low-grade cortisol release, and that's where we create disease. This is where you see chronic diseases slip in. Oftentimes is, we've got the genetic, the DNA passed down, but then there's also the learned responses, the intergenerational transmission of belief systems that we then start suppressing. And that's creating disease inside of us. So for me, one of the things that's important to realize is that this is just the beginning. This is like something that as you bring these things up, the intensity of the response is less each time, because you have a new piece of information, you get more of this outside of you, and it creates less stress as it's coming up. You start to be able to put the pieces, it's almost like it leaves little remnants of pieces of puzzles behind, that you're like, ooh, another piece. Oh, and here's a piece, and here's a piece. So it's like every single time you keep this space of receptivity, you have more of a piece to the puzzle. It's like this little blind spot and this little piece helps us create a whole picture. And I'm just gonna point out, like, who knows? Like, I could have a blind spot right now. I'm sure I do, right? So there are things that we're not looking to be perfect at. We're looking to be more whole. We're looking to be more complete. And that allows us to experience, and I talk often about being more happy and more joyous. And that is my experience, is I can accept and have peace and be in spaces when I have a better understanding of what's happening, when I feel this less stress, less disorientation, less confusion, allows for me to be at peace in this space. When you have a complete picture, or you have a better picture of what's happening, it doesn't mean that it's always going to be something good. There could be something that you're seeing that you're like, oh, I've got to deal with this. It's not always joyous what you're looking at, but at least there's not confusion around it, and you can deal with it. And you're not keeping those emotions inside you, but you're actually steeped in the reality of the emotions of what you're experiencing, and it makes sense in this world, and you can handle it, right? So I want to give you some kind of guiding suggestions that are kind of helpful during this excavation that you're entering into. Journaling is really important. That's that, time spent in silence, getting away, having self-reflection. Sometimes you're just asking yourself questions like, what did I experience? What did I see? What did I hear this other person say? Is what this other person said, does it resonate with me? Or could it be something about them? Oftentimes people, our situations are a mirror. So what we say actually is a really good clue as to what we're experiencing, because we're projecting out what is our lens. When we're saying, this is what's happening, it actually says, this is how I see the world. And so because I see the world this way, this is how I see the world, right? It gives us a clue of the filter or the lens that we're applying. But when we don't read meaning into situations and we just say, here's the facts of it. I responded this way. I said this thing. This person responded this way. They said this thing. Here was my emotion. Here was that person's emotion. When we start to get down to the facts, just reporting what we saw, the whole situation changes when we're not trying to give it meaning. And that's like when we're journaling and we're doing self-reflection. when we start to look at it that way, for me, it offers me an opportunity to have tremendous compassion towards myself, because I realize that there's this wounded piece of me that still wants to be heard and seen and consoled. And it allows for me to attend to that version of me, but it also allows me to do the same thing to other people. I'd much rather be compassionate and feel love and feel empathy and send light to other people because of a situation than to be mad at them, to believe the worst in them. I'm always looking for opportunities to extend that compassion to myself and others. And part of that is to be able to understand the wound inside somebody else and the wound inside of ourselves. It's also a way for us to ask ourselves, how would I want to respond? If I didn't respond in this spiked way because I started to have more awareness to it, I could anticipate how I want to respond, right? But it takes that self-reflection, that journaling, that asking ourselves questions when our brain is activated and looking at the whole situation that helps us get to that point. Another thing that you might ask yourself as you're journaling and reflecting is there a shadow side to something that is a passion of mine or a strength? There's always, like, when you're really good at something or something is a strength, oftentimes there's some shadow side. And this is like in relationships, we say, the very thing that I loved about this person now has a little edge of like something that rubs up against me, right? So there's always this other side. Like, for example, if you're really, really attuned to your surroundings and you always pay attention to somebody's like, wow, you always notice all these things. Well, the shadow side might be that creates a lot of anxiety. Maybe you're hyper vigilant for your safety and you're always paying attention to all these details because you're just trying to make sure that you're safe, right? So there's always like something that is like you're using it as a superpower and it's something good, but there could be something that is like, just like out here, there's always in here. Anytime something's going outside of you, you're interpreting something. So if I say something, I'm interpreting it. There's always this out and in kind of response. Another suggestion is to have radical honesty, right? When you realize that in your situation, when you've created safety, when you're entering into this and you're saying, I'm in this space, there's nothing around me that's going to hurt me. Anything that comes up right now isn't true. Like if it's a stress response, it's not true because I'm safe. Right here, right now, I'm safe. You can be radically honest, right? And it's important to just be able to say, I want to do better with how I responded, or I can't be around this because it causes me such anxiety. If I'm articulating something in a way that can be received and it's not being heard, then I may have to act different in order to, or I may not be able to be around this person. Like, those are real types of, that's radical honesty. Those are real reactions to a situation. And what that allows us to do is to tell our truth. When we're suppressing what we know that we need to do different or what we need to accept differently from the outside, it allows for us to articulate that to ourselves and to others, and to see if the situation can be entered into together so that we can change this. But if we have articulated that and it's not going to change, then it allows for us to make a conscious decision. And so that radical honesty is really important for our mental health, for our physical health, for our spiritual health. There's some part of us spiritually that is aching when we're not being honest with ourselves. So when possible, something else that is important, and this is going to have to be shared with yourself when your brain is not activated, but when you're actually calm, to recognize that what's happening outside of you with other people it's not about the other person, right? You are dealing with and being aware of other people's emotions and their reactions, but when you unearth these blind spots, that knowledge is for you. This is an opportunity for you to turn your love inward. You're not going to be able to change that other person. This isn't about their scripts. This isn't about pointing out to them something about them. This is about blind spots are about us. Now, if it happens to when we shift our filter, if it happens to change what's outside of us because we're acting differently and it changes somebody else, their response, okay. But that's not why we're doing it. We're doing it because we want a different response, right? We're trying to apply a new filter. When we have awareness, it allows for us to see the world differently. It allows for us to change our belief system. And when our belief system changes, our experience changes with the world outside of us, right? That's why we're doing this, is we want a different experience. The other thing is why we're wanting a different experience too is because I've started to look at blind spots as, unfortunately, it's a form of like self-manipulation. When we apply a blind spot, it's like allowing the biological organism that's inside of us to say, no, you, potential human being that you can be, we don't want you to do that because this isn't safe. But it's not true. And so it's like when we're doing conscious manipulation, it's like we're suppressing. We're saying, no, I'm not going to do this. And we're choosing very aggressively to push something back, which then stuffs it in there. There's so much pressure and physical feelings inside of us, right? But this is like when it's an unconscious manipulation, then it's like this victim script. It activates this fight, flight, freeze response, right? And so for me, I'm like, I'm not going to have some autonomic response, some part of me that's just trying to protect me and it's not true, manipulating me. I'm going to get firmly seated in myself and start to have conscious awareness about what's happening and deal with radical honesty with I want to excavate my truth and the truth about this situation from a new lens, a new belief system, so that I can have a different result in life, right? So when we accept, our hope is that we start to become able to consciously, this awareness is allowing us to consciously plan for, hey, in this kind of a situation, I tend to get stressed. I'm going to be aware that here's how I want to respond. I want to keep calm. I'm going to take some breaths. I'm going to walk outside and take 5 minutes and then I'm going to come back in. I'm going to know that when this situation comes up, I'm going to activate this. If you're with somebody that's trusted, like Brene talks about her and her husband and how they have this understanding with this particular scenario that was going on in their minds. And so when you have that happen, then you have somebody else that's safe that you can enter into this with, that can say, hey, I think we're doing this thing again. We're supposed to do this. And it's like this agreed upon response. It's so great to have somebody enter into that with you, so that you can choose again, right? And all of this, when possible, like when you're looking at this and you're doing this self-reflection and you're trying to have this radical honesty, when possible, try to get a change of scenery. That is super important to kind of get out of an environment where something's happening. Always be kind to yourself. And when you start to notice those stress hormones come up, back off a little before you enter back into it, so that you can feel safe and you can have your brain activated and centered, because when your brain's activated, you're not going to be able to think about this from a fresh perspective. It's going to be submitting stress hormones. You're always going to want to think and act from your values and your integrity, which comes from your truth. And that is from a space where you're safe and you're allowed to be able to, think. And my last thing I want to mention around this topic is that my hope is that this can be used for us personally, that we don't use this information again to weaponize awareness in other people. This is an opportunity to extend compassion, but it's not, we can't illuminate other people's path. They have to see something. It's just like I talked about in the memoir. If they see something in you or in somebody else's story, that's where they can have the biggest reflection and self-awareness, but it's not going to be from somebody pointing out to them their blind spots. So I hope that this is I hope that this is helpful to you all, and I want to thank you for listening. I know that this can be a challenging topic. I also want to thank Micah Mackenzie, as always, for the amazing portal art for the cover art. He's a local artist. You can check out Micah's work on Instagram. I have some new offerings. I've got my new workshops posted. September 6th, I have one coming up on Authentically You. It's a 6-week program, so I'd love for you guys to check it out, as well as Change Your Energy, Change Your Life. It's coming up at the end of August, so I'd love to see you there. And I have Carol May Whittick from London. She's a creative and spiritual coach who I'm going to be interviewing, and that interview is going to be coming out next Monday. It's an amazing conversation, and I'm so excited for you to hear it. So check that out. And until next time, peace, love, and light, my friends.